Cool. Okay. So, sorry, where did I cut out there? I was saying internships would be probably a great opportunity in the Luna Swarm as well for people who are interested in learning more about cadCAD and being part of this model creation learning opportunity. So for people who are really interested but aren't quite sure how their skills match up with what's required for the project, this is definitely an opportunity. Is that of interest to anybody here? Is there any feedback on the proposal so far? Okay,
I, I don't
just
I don't I don't really think so. Not too much. I know that Tonga had some opinions about it, and um, I don't know if anyone else does, but I don't feel that it needs to be more than what it is.
Okay, cool. And the intention for this is that this proposal covers like the project setup. This is like the first month, and there will be subsequent proposals to carry out further modeling. And this is definitely a longer term horizon than just 1 month. So yeah, so for this initial proposal, as long as we are all good with the 20 honey requested, this is basically covering some time of Luke's and Zargum's in getting this project up and running, as well as myself and Jess for like doing the project coordination and PMing. And otherwise, we can just get this first proposal in, covering the first month of work, and then we'll submit subsequent proposals for more work on later parts of modeling honey issuance. Is there anybody opposed to that, or any other thoughts to consider before putting this proposal up?
Just to add to that, I mean, I think we had a discussion, Jeff and I had a discussion with Luke the other day, and Luke seems to be the main modeler, and we may be recruiting one other that act in the kind of like mentor role. And then the interns that come on can maybe get like a POAP certificate, like a proof of participation. And we can consider going forward what other resources could be necessary. But we're kind of seeing if there are going to be some interns under Luke. So far, I mean, he's not going to chase after people, I guess, to intern with him. But if there's anybody, he can maybe take one or two interns that are very committed for the long term in learning cadCAD. Then he's willing to invest time. And Luke, I don't want to speak for you, but yeah, this first proposal is just for the kickoff. And then as we establish needing more resources, modelers, maybe one other Luke level or above cadCAD modeler with expertise besides Zargum that can take on another intern or two. But for now,
I'm
this
here,
is
by the
off.
way. I'm having issues with. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
So I'm having internet issues, so I just connected from my phone. But just as like kind of throw in there, like I'm just considering myself a mentor, and for the moment, I'm kind of trying to be available to Luke and to whomever else kind of hops in on the project. So to the point that Jeff and Jess were making, the key here is just to have a little bit of funding for upstart stuff, and as we get clarity on scope, we can submit proposals to fund specific researchers or specific research projects. And I think that kind of strikes the balance between funding without clarity and also, well, yeah, what they said. So as long as people are comfortable with this, I think it's as good as any of a starting point. It respects the work of people who are getting things up and running, but it doesn't like lock us in. We're not saying this is this much honey is all it takes to run this project. We're just saying this is what we want to spend to get set up.
Cool. And I have a call today with Sean Anderson. He's a modeler, and I'm going to ask him his bandwidth if he would like to be in a mentorship position. He's the one teaching our TEC labs for like pre-cadCAD. So I'm going to talk to him and see if he wants to jump in on this project and take an intern or two under his wing, as he's already training people and is very interested in cadCAD education. So yeah, I think this is great. So if everybody says yes, I'm going to go ahead and submit this today or during this call, actually, since I'm going to block some time to do that.
Sounds good to me.
And I don't know if this came up before I managed to get on, but my ask for this call had been just to kind of do this 10 minutes of manage the stuff. And then ideally, I would prefer this to be more of a collaborative work session than, we don't need more meetings. I'm sure you guys all have meetings. I think this is going to be fun if we're opening up notebooks and like, brainstorming and like learning and anyway, that was my
But
hope. I realize I can't do that because I'm going to be looking at it on my phone. But insofar as the others, Luke in particular, are interested, I will be able to see as long as I stick my face in my phone, even though I can't really present. And maybe I'll figure out how to get into Discord on my computer if the internet is the gods of the internet give me that affordance.
See,
I was kind of hoping for the same thing.
well, and maybe going forward, then these are more going to be work sessions unless there's any admin things that need addressing. So I'm going to spend this time. I'm just pretty much sitting here with you guys, and I'm going to spend this time on doing my work, which is submitting the proposals, which is very easy. And then going forward, like basically
It should always be 10-ish minutes of the slot. It's going to be like, even if it's 2 minutes at the beginning and a few minutes at the end, we've found similar patterns even with our Block.Science project teams. A lot of it is, where are we at? Check in. Okay, everybody's good. Let's do a work session. Towards the end of it, we're usually saying, cool, what's the next work? And does anybody want to like kind of volunteer to take on any specific tasks? And as long as we kind of bookend with that, I think the rest of the body of the meeting should almost always be like work centered.
Cool. Sounds great. Take it away, Luke and Lee.
All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen with the notebook that I've been working on. And we can start there. Figure out screen. Let me know if this shows up for everybody. Okay. And Z, do I need to like Zoom or anything like that for you?
That helps a little bit. Yeah, I'm able to read it now. I'm literally I got in like wide mode and I'm following along. Perfect. Yeah, that's fine. I can read that. Thank you very much for
Okay. How do I close the Explorer in VS Code?
Oh,
Can I do that? Ah, there we go.
Yeah.
I don't know what I did, but it worked.
Fair enough.
I'll have to figure out later how to get it back. But
yeah. The other
cool.
thing you can do if you're messing with VS Code, and Jeff and I were just talking about this, Danilo has kind of figured out a way to do shared environments, so you can actually publish and do co-working sessions on the same runtime. So in the future, when my computer works, if we figure that out, we would actually be able to pair or even group code. So like throw in some stuff and try it on the fly during the call.
Super cool. Yeah, that'd be fun. I'm just going to do a quick run through of this. I think you're already familiar with most of it, but I made some changes and then did some analysis and was kind of hoping we could kind of go through those changes in the analysis and see if I'm sort of in a good spot and kind of where to go from there. But essentially, I set it up after going through the cadCAD course with multiple runs with different parameters to compare different scenarios. And I've got like charts on the bottom, so I'll kind of wait to go down there. The other sort of change was we switched the like proportional control mechanism from this one, which we were using before, to this one on Sandpiper's suggestion, which seems to kind of give it a little bit like makes it actually converge towards the target more effectively. And then we have the throttle, which bounds issuance or burning to a certain percentage of the supply. And then everything else I think is basically the same. Pretty simple update block here. And we run the model. And so, yeah, I set up those parameters so that we could kind of look at a couple of different scenarios. One where we don't set a throttle, and I just kind of picked this as an arbitrary baseline in terms of like the target reserve. The outflow rate is kind of derived based on the maximum possible like rate from conviction voting, and it would be really, I've tried to figure this out, and I might need some assistance in terms of how to derive it. or how to go about it, but deriving what the maximum outflow rate for conviction based on the uh, parameters of conviction voting, like alpha and the decay and all of that, doesn't seem very intuitive.
How fast? Like if like the bounds come from if you have so you have a minimum time on a proposal, right? Like the parameter that was in my original code. I'm not sure if it ended up in the implementation, but the like a proposal needs to be like in it needs to be available for a minimum period of time before it can pass, even if it has enough conviction. Do we have that parameter?
In the implementation, we do. We have a minimum threshold. But,
so the reason I say that is because the minimum time gives you the time bound. It's sort of a coordinate transform. So although technically you're not likely to go faster than something, in theory, if you took a whole bunch of capital, like enough capital to pass something, and you could just like loop, you would pass something, you'd get it back, you'd pass something, you'd get it back, and that allows you to go almost arbitrarily fast. The moment that you put any period of time as a rate lock, that means that you can go no faster than that, and will give you hard lower bounds, as opposed to sort of these are like soft lower bounds, or they're not really bounds. They're just like it would be unrealistic for it to go out faster than blah because of how fast people actually do stuff. But if you took enough conviction to pass a proposal of a certain size, you could literally propose a proposal, back it, clear it, take your money, propose a proposal, back it, clear it, which allows you to go effectively arbitrarily fast. The moment that
I don't think that's true though, right? Like, because there's a minimum threshold, and there's like a decay period.
Yeah. That just means you have to have that much more capital, because there are things for which. So if you make a small enough request, you are gonna have the next time step. Your conviction is 1 unit worth. Not you see how it charts. You see what I mean? So like I'm not saying that it's easy. But it doesn't have a hard bound unless you have a time window. Because if you have a time window, you can say but now this can happen no faster than a certain rate. But if you don't have a time window, then you can just basically try to do that in a loop.
Don't you have like an implicit time window?
Yeah, I guess you do. You kind of have an implicit time window of 1. Yeah, I think that's fair. I'm just basically saying that the lower bound is... The way that I made the lower bound feel like it made more sense was to say in the original model that... Look, like we don't expect, but we also don't want something to pass faster than, say, a day. And then you can suddenly interpret those rates as you get a kind of a day time scale rate limit. Whereas if you're talking about blocks or you're talking about even like minutes, it starts to be like a genuine exponential decay. You can get, may only be able to get 0.1% out, but you can just do it constantly. And
yeah, but I think like even if you have that like rate limit, if you're like perfectly coordinated and strategically trying to maximize outflow, like you control all of the honey, and you're just trying to like within the bounds of conviction voting, the strategy to do that might be you have a bunch of simultaneous proposals and you've like split your stake.
I'm 100% with you. It is like out the wazoo ridiculous. The kind of optimal strategy and the coordination and execution of it required to realize that is insane and unlikely. So it's this difference between what I'm calling a hard bound in the algorithmic sense, which is literally for all possible legal actions, how fast can you remove the funds, versus something a bit more realistic, which is like, what's the realistic rate at which the funds could be expended? Under like soft bound versus hard bound from like a mathy sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like, because that's complicated. We have this, and I'm kind of would lean towards pushing to have this throttle where we control the maximum issuance rate, regardless of the parameters of conviction voting, which is sort of the second scenario.
If you want to make this a little less like fuzzy and a little bit still not too complicated, remember that the outflow rate is observable. So like you can define it you can compute it, and you could define it in your policy. You could literally design a policy that itself was a function of the observed outflow rate. So you don't have to worry about any of this crazy fast outflow rate unless you experience a really fast outflow rate, because a really fast outflow rate is observable.
Yeah, but I think that like the I guess one of the challenges is we need to be able to provide a lot of certainty for people that want to understand the like maximum supply over time. And if it's very, very fuzzy, it's hard to do that. So what I was sort of thinking is if we define the like throttle so that we have a maximum like rate of change in terms of the supply, we can give with just a single parameter a lot of certainty in terms of like the worst case scenario for people that are like worried about dilution of what the supply would be. In practice, we would expect it to be much less than that because the actual outflow rates would be less. But like we would be bounded by that. And then we could have discretionary governance over the conviction parameters such that like depending on what we observe as the actual outflow rate, we can adjust the parameters based on that. So like maybe the actual like theoretical max outflow is much higher than the throttle, but the actual like realized outflow lines up and we have a balanced system. I'm like much more comfortable having discretionary governance over those conviction voting parameters if we can have this other higher level like max parameter that gives people like strong certainty in terms of like actual outflows.
We're
So you don't
talking
feel
about
like you're just
creating like a sort of upper and lower bound on the issuance rate in a sense, and then all that's happening really is that the conviction voting parameters plus real human behavior can resolve to somewhere in the range. So you can always say, minting is going to happen between this rate and that rate, but where in that range will depend on the discretionary choices of the conviction voting parameters and the specific behavior of people in the conviction voting algorithm.
Yeah. So
I think that's right. I think the key here, though, is that you've got two components. One is a uncontrolled parameter, and one is a controlled parameter in the language we tend to use with Block.Science. The uncontrolled parameter is essentially the rates at which proposals are passing. So you, in a way, maybe you could think about it as, we might want to abstract it as something like the statistics of a process that generates newly passed proposals. And so that would be a random process for Monte Carlos. And we could say, well, it could be faster or slower depending on the coin flips, but that's the sort of random process saying, basically the rate at which this thing is expending funds. It can be smaller or larger. The controlled parameters are the conviction voting parameters. So we would want to use some maybe simplified version of the conviction voting model to create a relationship between the conviction voting parameters and that passing process. So like if you make it harder to pass processes, so you turn up. Can you hear me? Am I talking too much?
No, you're good. Rodrigo just joined and he had an echo, so he muted.
Gotcha. Cool. So yeah, so what I'm thinking out loud is how to move in the direction you're describing, and I guess I know that I'm doing this verbally, but there's this concept that we use with our models in Block.Science, and I'll revisit it. We talked about the difference between a controlled parameter and uncontrolled parameter. When we are building our cadCAD models, we include both as parameters, but they have a difference in what they represent. A controlled parameter is like a parameter of the system that you can set, and an uncontrolled parameter is it's still a parameter that you set in the cadCAD model, but in real life you don't set it. It's usually a parameter of a statistical distribution or something that represents a variable in a behavioral model. And in this case, we would be saying something like, okay, given our model of conviction voting, the statistic over which how fast proposals pass and how much money is issued, they're not independent of the parameters of the conviction voting algorithm. So the slower things charge up, and the various parameters that we analyzed in the other model sort of show us a relationship between turn the parameter up, decrease the rate at which things would pass, not in an absolute sense, but just it takes more effort and more coordination on the part of the contributors to generate a passed proposal. Thus, proposals will be passed slower, and thus money will flow out more slowly. That it's that statistical relationship between the rate at which funds are dispersed and the CAD and the conviction voting parameters. That seems to me like the crux of the bit that we would want to bring in here in order to understand whether an issuance policy sort of makes sense. And maybe going back to what makes sense means we're proposing that the ideal issuance policy would have an upper and lower bound issuance rate, and that we would, as we accelerated the rate at which proposals passed, it might go towards the upper bound. And as we decelerated the rate as proposals passed, it might go towards the lower bound. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense, but I'm not sure what it analytically helps us answer. Versus
Well, I guess it's a question of what
versus like the worst case, right?
Well, the worst case scenario that I can imagine here would be when the funds issue, when the least, I guess, in order to define a worst case scenario, we have to describe which metric we're using to describe worst. So, like, even best and worst are essentially linear, or not linear, they're scalar. There is an idea that because the system is high dimensional, you'd have to pick a metric, and then given that metric, you could say something was, best or worse, or relatively speaking, you would compare them on that metric. But because you kind of have maybe multiple value propositions here, you might be better on one metric and worse on another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But okay, so maybe what I'm saying is maybe we could work backwards from talking about metrics. So if you want the idea of best and worst, we could even as a group talk about what characterizes good. And then we could ask like whether we could measure that from the model and look at how well a given run performs, because then if you wanted to say change parameters or change policies, you would compare the policies based on, how their relative performance under one or more measures.
I mean, I guess there's like there's two kind of properties or measures that I'm kind of interested in looking at here. One is we want to be able to communicate the and when I say worst case, I mean the worst case in terms of dilution. So like if you're a honey holder today and you're deciding whether you want to buy honey and you want to project out 10 years with a certain degree of certainty, you want to know like what the worst case is in terms of dilution. So what's the maximum issuance that could happen? There's some degree of discretion. It might be less, but it's not going to be more. And that's sort of what I meant by the like.
Issuance is just projecting the upper bound. So if you take the upper, and I think you have those plots that you're saying if you say that the issuance rate is going to go in between a range between minimum value and maximum value, then if you want the worst case scenario, you're simply saying the upper bound is the value every time for the whole period, and asking how much new supply is created in that scenario.
Correct. And then I guess the other piece, which maybe it's not as relevant. So like if we introduce this plot here is with the throttle set it, like this allows us to kind of directly set the maximum issuance. So I think it's set at like 5% per year in this like data set. And so you can see after 10 years, like the supply is under 40K as sort of a maximum. And those are arbitrary like parameters, but that would give us the maximum boundary. But we also see that the like reserves because the outflow rate is higher than the like ability for the issuance policy to kind of correct. Doesn't like it gets further and further away from their like reserve target. So the system, in assuming the worst case, doesn't like have kind of that stable balance in terms of like reserves to supply. End up hitting the like rate limiter the like entire time, so it sort of diverges.
I think the biggest thing that this is currently missing that would make it more realistic to construct scenarios is something about the again, I started to say it, even if we keep it very simple, the expenditure rates. So I know you kind of have that. I don't know if we can look at where it is. You think of the conviction voting subsystem as a like just something that issues funds. So like how are you generating the thing that represents what the common pool is spending? Because I think what we don't currently have is any notion of a relationship between sort of value created and expenditures. Because remember, if you're a honey holder, part of the value of honey is, I won't say it's attached to association to this system. So if it's highly productive, meaning you're issuing funds, those funds are going to people, those people are doing cool shit, and that stuff is sort of incident on the world, you're going to be producing a sort of so let's say you're producing some kind of intrinsic value. Although you can't measure it directly, from a modeling perspective, you might just suppose that we have some effectiveness, some efficacy, if you will, that says, all right, per unit dollar spent, we generate, I don't know, some value. Just, again, it's abstracted. It's just call it real world value and say every time we spend money, we're going to flip a coin and we're going to generate some value equal to the amount of that coin. And maybe sometimes it's small, sometimes it's large, or whatever distribution we want. We might look at that accumulation as something that, in a sense, backs the value of this system. So if you're inflating the supply, or excuse me, if you're increasing the supply, but if you're doing so in a system that is succeeding in producing a lot of value, you may not actually be inflating the token in the sense that its value is declining. So it's something, and again, it's tricky to get your head around it, but like we're saying, even though we can't necessarily measure this value directly, the phenomena that we observe in these systems is that if we're able to produce and maintain this positive, say, footprint in the world, that's going to serve as a sort of backstop to those assets. And we're arguing that maybe that value, it doesn't decay super fast. I could imagine having both a production function, meaning we spend money, we flip a coin for how much new value is produced, and then we drain some of that value. We just say, like, look, it decays over time. It's less interesting to people, or maybe new stuff has come up elsewhere. But even something as simple as a bucket in your state, which is called intrinsic value, and every time you spend money, you sort of flip a coin that's sort of weighted by how much you spent and determine how much new real value you made, and then drain a little bit of that, thinking of it as depreciating. If you just do something as simple as that, there's some important metrics that will come out about this when you start comparing the extent to which you are expanding the monetary base relative to the value you're producing and maintaining, because otherwise you're going to kind of always eventually screw people, because they're going to have a thing that there's more of without it being anchored back to more of something. Does that make sense? So intuitively, you're stepping into a little bit more of the social modeling, but you don't need to make super strong assumptions. You can say, well, we don't know how fast this is going to accumulate, and we don't know how fast it's going to drain, but you could run parameter sweeps where you say, suppose it grows really fast and it decays really slow. Now your sort of token value relative to intrinsic value is really great. Or you could say, well, we produce it really slow and it decays really fast. In which case, you're kind of back to the setting, well, hey, maybe I'm growing the supply too fast. But push comes to shove, there's something out in the world that's being produced, and the value of honey and your capacity to issue more of it to create more value is actually tied back to this other process where we turn money into value, and that we manage to maintain that value and continue to have people attach value to it. And that's like the really simplest way of encoding that. Obviously, there's a lot more that one could do to create richer models of value creation. But I think if you want to start to build intuition about minting, you can't get away without at least a little bit of our expenditures produce something, and that thing it produces, accumulates, even if it can decay a little bit too. Does that make sense?
It does, but it also feels like then whatever arbitrary assumptions you make about that determine like.
Oh yeah, that's why you then have to do sensitivity.
Then you've got a value.
Yeah, so then what you end up,
valuation
and your
model
results become really dependent on those two parameters, right? If I say what's the say I use like an exponential function for the value creation coin, and I say exponential function with mean 1, and I say decay function with like rate 0.01. So 1% of the value decays every period, and every time I flip, I produce something, I get, the number of dollars times an exponential distribution with mean 1. And that's how I accumulate and decay. But those two parameters, the decay rate and the sort of mean of the exponential function, become parameters that will have a big impact on your system. So you would then run experiments that swept those particular parameters, and you'd try to understand how sensitive the system was, or you'd look for tipping points and try to basically say, okay, well, our policies make sense over the widest range of assumptions, or our policies on the safe side of the tipping point, and start to say like, hey, at some threshold, we'll suddenly see a problem where if we can't produce at least this much, then no matter what we do, we're gonna overinflate our economy. Like, I get that what I'm introducing here are degrees of freedom that are subjective. The way you counter that is by basically taking lots of values and saying, we know that we don't know, let's see what happens on a range of values, and then we're asking questions about sensitivity instead of questions about like optimality. But then you can come back to the policies you're designing and try to say like, look, okay, we have this phenomenological model of value creation. We think we have an understanding of what's maybe the more realistic subset of that. Again, it's an abstraction in the way that like story points and agile are an abstraction. It doesn't have a real unit. It doesn't until you attach it to some real world stuff. So if you then went back and looked at some cool stuff we were doing or historical prices and tried to back out a unit for this so that we could throw in some realistic values, that would help you do some like kind of, I won't say like full empirical, but sort of like empirically informed experiments. And again, this is like the kind of stuff that we often end up doing when we're trying to make policies. I'm not suggesting that you have to do all this stuff in order to make a policy for one hive, but I am suggesting that if you make a policy, that you could actually then go back and reevaluate that policy 3 months or 6 months later by incorporating in something that was sort of meant to be an empirical representation of that concept, whether that's new users or if it's total new features deployed, or whether it's like something that we would use to anchor or substantiate this idea of value created and maintained, that could be attached to, oh, well, we develop about this many new features and get maybe this many new users, etc., per $1,000 worth of honey that we kicked out. But you need like 6 months of data probably before that starts to be meaningful, because otherwise you're just like small sample size. So again, it's like doing velocities in Scrum. They don't really exist until you have data.
Yeah, I mean, I'd taken a look at an older model in one of the repos that you did. I think it was the 3-sided market model, and there was like a stochastic growth process or inflows or fee transaction volume, and there was a
Yeah.
like stochastic process for the cost of like I guess services or labor.
Yeah, those are
And then
basically
you
made
could,
up.
yeah,
Also, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, like, you start by making up functional forms and running experiments, but once you start going, what you try to do is tether them back to real observations. So the ones in the three-sided market model are borrowed from experience I have with like sort of marketing and adoption models on the adoption side. So they tend to be they're called well, they generate S curves. They look like logistic curves when you run them, but there's a name for it. They're basically saturated. They're effectively saturated exponentials. They're really common in population modeling. And for some reason, I can't remember the name of them right now. But anyway. They show up in marketing analysis too, because you have this sort of total potential addressable market, and your sort of awareness rises basically exponentially at the beginning because you're not anywhere near the constraint, but then you get a kind of tipping point because you're now you have fewer people to reach because you've already reached a significant share of them. So I borrowed a variation of those models from again, they show up both in marketing and epidemiology and in other like population statistic dynamics, like even moving on. And then in terms of the costs one, borrowed just from some models I'd used in the past in operations management stuff, where you have costs that are high up front and they decline over time as your team improves, as your tools improve, whatever. Generally, the ease of providing the same service goes up, so the cost of doing it goes down. So like I used basically some relatively ad hoc model choices for those phenomena, but I borrowed them from past experience where I had data that substantiated those shapes.
gotcha. So like if you're, I
Go
mean,
ahead.
so if whether we do it that way or the way that you had originally suggested, where we relate some degree of like positive output from the outflows in some random process, where we
Well,
relate
it's the
that
same
to,
kind of
to,
thing.
like,
It's just a different phenomena. The point I'm trying to make is that in the case of a specific model, you take a moment and reflect on the phenomena that you are modeling, and then you look for a functional form that you think is a good representation or a good fit of that. But then that's just the math shape. That's not the data yet. You then need to have some data either from past real world experience, or maybe you use the functional form and then you make some observations in the data and you kind of go back to it. It's always kind of iterative. You start with your past experience to come up with a functional form based on phenomena. Then you run some experiments with made up parameters. But then as time goes on, you want to replace made up parameters more with things that you think are realistic by fitting those parameters to your real observations.
do you think that like modulating the issuance is one of those things that we would be able to reasonably adjust based on data, or is it something that like I think one of the challenges
Not in real time. Yeah, so okay, so what I'm trying to say is that modulating issuance is effectively steering this other process. The process that we really want to steer is we're going to create tokens into the funding pool to make sure that the funding pool always has funds to fund projects, because projects generate value, and value essentially means that it's okay if there's more value. It's okay to have more tokens, because at the end of the day, even if the linkage is abstract, the tokens are backed by the capacity of OneHive to spend it to create more valuable shit. And so I'm describing that phenomena in the simplest mathematical form I can, because I'm imagining testing some scenarios, even if the numbers are made up, to see whether the policy that you have for reserve ratio and throttle and outflow rate sort of stands up to the question, okay, well, what happens if we suddenly spend a lot of money, but we make lots of really cool stuff? versus what happens if we spend lots of money and we don't make lots of really cool stuff, because those are going to have really different effects on this system.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It seems like in the case of like the actual like hard issuance rate, like the throttle, it feels like something that I don't think we're going to want to touch hardly at all. We might even want to throw away the key. In the same way that like deciding on the issuance schedule for Bitcoin is part of the reason that it's so successful, even if like down the line it might actually be faulty. Having that like very like strong fence around that policy it makes it actually work over a very long time horizon.
You can accomplish that by using those bounds that we talked about at the beginning. You can make a really strong policy that says, I will never go faster than this. But that leaves you a ton of degrees of freedom for your system to still have a policy within that range. So and I think you're already kind of doing that, right? Like that's why you have these like the throttle here at all, is that you're setting yourself up to say, look, this policy, it outputs a rate of new token issuance. But this rate of new token issuance is not unbounded. It can grow no faster than this. But even within that range, there's a lot of different things that could happen, and you want that remaining degree of freedom to be something that maybe you can iterate on the policy, but also it's supposed to do something really specific. It's supposed to induce the OneHive community to produce valuable stuff, not just to produce stuff, not just to spend money, but ideally we want to find a way, at least normatively, to align ourselves with, hey, look, if we're not producing valuable stuff, maybe we need to turn this down until we figure out how to produce stuff that's valuable. Whatever, again, we're talking about this challenge where the code meets the humans. How do we, as the group, work within that range from 0 issuance to max issuance rate? But that's still within our discretion. We're only saying we should make it so we can never issue it faster than something. We still have to decide to go faster or slower within that range in order to align ourselves to produce valuable stuff.
Well, that's kind of what the conviction voting, like if we treat it as a black box here, would be doing, right? Like if you're a honey holder and you choose to abstain or signal towards a non-funding proposal, you're slowing the rate and potentially also like resulting in burning of tokens, depending on where the like target reserve ratio is. So you've got like this large degree of discretion, both in terms of the policies for conviction voting like parameters, but also just in terms of conviction voting, whether we should go fast or slow, right?
Yeah, that's totally true. That's what we were talking about before when I was talking about the model and potentially extending it to start to build it up. Because remember, I told you to make this only on issuance because I didn't want to overcomplicate the model, build it up iteratively. You're getting to the point where it might start to make sense to reintroduce some of the components from the conviction voting model to study the relationship between those things. So like if you had tried to write this model on that model, you wouldn't have had the opportunity to focus on thinking through issuance the way that you have. You now have gotten far enough on issuance that I think you have a pretty compelling conclusion, which is, for starters, we should set a maximum issuance and pretty much throw away the key, albeit it might need to be a little bit liberal because we're just saying we're going to be somewhere in this range, but it'll already give people a first order set of trust. Like OneHive is not going to mint honey faster than this rate. It might be slower. In fact, it'll probably be slower, but it won't be faster than this. And then we have still a little bit of middle ground here where we try to understand how that sort of within the slower than that rate policy works. Well, we have an interplay between your rules and how fast the conviction voting algorithm actually dispenses funding. And I think my point about the random processes before was that we could look at how, like a scenario where we said, suppose the conviction voting was happening really fast, like what would that imply? And we would say, oh, well, that would imply we're near the max. Okay, but now the supply is growing really fast. Okay, but what happens if we're issuing lots of projects, but they're really cool and it's creating lots of value? Then our value accumulator is actually growing really fast. And so we say, you know what? It doesn't matter that we're near the max. We're producing tons of value. On the other hand, we're saying, well, but what if we're pushing out lots of money and it's not creating lots of value? We see clearly that that's going to damage our token value, so we don't want to do that, which helps people see more directly the consequence of, not taking the time to evaluate projects, right? This literally, like mathematically, albeit somewhat synthetically, ties the notion of we did cool shit to your token is valuable, and we were efficient enough at doing cool shit that even though we minted more tokens at, say, the max rate, we still managed to make the token value go up in the sense that it's relative to the, quote, value produced.
I think that makes sense, but it sort of feels like we can potentially answer the issuance policy question without going down that rabbit hole in terms of the throttle, at least.
Yeah,
and
I think you can first policy, Luke, is very simple. Never mint more than X per period delta T. I think you can 100% go ahead and do that without doing more modeling. I think, and you can more or less make that concrete as long as you get social buy-in, but that we have to separate that away from the more nuanced question of how much of that minting capacity we actually use.
Cool. Yeah, definitely on the same page there. And looking forward to kind of trying to figure out how to incorporate some of that stuff in. I might try and explore a few things and then ask for your feedback midweek, if that's possible.
That makes sense. Also, another thing we can chat, maybe in DMs, there's definitely still work that we have from Block.Science that is like what I'll call jailbreakable, in the sense that we often end up writing versions of our methods that we end up delivering to clients, in part because we give them a bunch of deliverables and then we write up documents that explain the methods to them. And some of those documents are only accessible under NDA in their current form, but that they just basically contain Block.Science briefs on how to do stuff. And so I'm going to continue to try to prioritize or even look for help breaking those out. But it just takes time, because I got to do it with people who are, both incentive aligned and under NDA, because I have to go, okay, here's a deliverable for a client. We're not going to look at that. I set that aside. Here's a different thing that we wrote up that explains to the client how we did it. And that's got a little too much detail to just open source, but we can clean. We've been working on cleaning those out and trying to make them more open sourceable. So that's something I know Jeff has had a hand in, and we should continue to look for ways to do that, Luke. Because as you level up, you might be a good person to have doing some of that. Oh, I learned how to do this thing, and now I'm going to apply it to my project, and then now it's in open source where everyone can see it.
Yeah, definitely. Is there, besides the demo repo, I guess there was a Notion page somewhere as well, but is there a kind of library of open source models? I've definitely tried to find a few for learning purposes, and the ones in the cadCAD EDU course are really good.
We really just need
I don't know if there's a central repo.
I think Jeff made that Notion, and I think it had a bunch. I don't think it's exhaustive, though. Actually, if this is a thing we could throw out as an issue that people might be, if people are interested in, just hunting them down and then putting them somewhere public, even if it's just in cadCAD, the cadCAD.org or the demos repo, where we don't have everyone's models, we just have ours. Ours meaning ones people have contributed. We could make a list or a markdown file that just where we maintain a list of active repos, because I think there's a very large growing number, but we don't currently have a really good point of reference for all. They just keep popping up.
Yeah, I've definitely found a few, so I can start a list somewhere and we can figure out where to put it. I know some of them also are using old versions of cadCAD, so they don't work anymore.
We're working on upgrading them. Andrew has I mentioned the 3-sided Andrew was so kind as to update that. I think he's going to merge it in the next couple days. We also built a Gitcoin model in collaboration with the Gitcoin team, which should go to open source in like a week or so, which hopefully will be valuable. And also, a long time ago I made a source cred model that was like, it's definitely not up to date, but if honestly, like, I would love to submit a proposal for someone to just bring that all the way up to bear, like ideally even like match it up with some of what we've seen from Pollen. But honestly, like, I don't have the capacity to do much more than give advice, but there's a code base of an old version of cadCAD, like, so we have the thing that shows how to update it, and then we'd have to kind of go through the current state of source cred to update to match the algorithms to the implementation. But it could be really powerful in the context of OneHive because you have Pollen. So bringing the source cred one up to date, I think would be a quick win for somebody who wanted to learn how to use cadCAD.
Sandpiper, does that sound interesting at all to you?
Sure. I need to talk about it with you guys more, but yeah.
Anyway, I think that would be something we could fund directly, because we started off by talking about how to manage the project, and like, if we were to say there was a project to bring the source cred one first to update it to the current cadCAD standards based on what the project structure is, and second to update the logic in it to match the current source cred, and then third to integrate it with data from Pollen. That would be a kick-ass project. It would take a little while and it would definitely take some funding, but I think it's actually pretty damn well defined.
So we're hitting the top of the hour here, and I have to jump to another call, but I think there is a bit of a question, and I kind of want to keep this as low overhead and as possible and put it to rest a bit, but there is still attention needed. So people are asking, obviously, about the contributions. I think it's still a little unclear. So I drafted a message. Sandpiper was asking about the breakdown of the rates and specific roles. So I just I'm making a message that's really clear and saying, like, basically, look, Luke is head coder, and Zargum, you're going to be mentoring and taking on one or two kind of interns that will not be compensated, that will receive like a little certificate, or they're getting valuable skills. And then anyone that actually has modeling, that's for people with no modeling experience, and they need to speak up soon. And then for people that have modeling experience, if they would like to model but not mentor, are we open to those people? And people are asking about rates, roles, and I know, Luke, you don't really want to manage this. You and Z don't really care. You're so busy. I'm also super busy, and I can take on this, or if it's needed. But I mean, Sandpiper, we could use somebody that's
we could do it scope based. So Jess, I think the main reason why I flagged this one is because I described scope, not hours. It's really unclear for us how to do hours. I think it's just been difficult because we're still figuring this stuff out. But with the project that I just described, if someone were to want to do it, we would fund it by scope, not by time.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm just going to draft a message just saying, yeah, we're doing this on a per project basis. We're just getting this funding to kick it off. It's been hours to kind of get it off the ground. And then anybody who wants to contribute, it's kind of like a one-on-one basis. It's not that huge of a project anyhow. So, but I just want to make it clear for people who are new. And Luke, is that correct, that you just want to take one or two people kind of under your wing who are committed for the long term to learning cadCAD? And then those people are not, just that it's clear that there's not compensation, that it's the value of the skills and maybe a certificate, because I think clarity is maybe needed. And I'm just trying to draft a little something for the Luna Swarm channel, just so a few people have asked, and just to be super clear that it's somewhat unclear, but there are parts that know.
In my mind, the budget for this like initial month is really like operational, like note-taking, coordination, making sure we've got like calls and follow-ups, and we're like reporting things, and it's really intended to compensate people for those roles. The like actual modeling work, even my own modeling work, I see it as primarily a learning experience. I'm getting a lot of value out of that, and I'm happy to collaborate and work with, whether you call them interns or other people that are interested in learning cadCAD on these projects. And then once we kind of feel comfortable in terms of like skills and output. Coordinating specific scoped projects that we could fund separately makes sense. But right now, like in terms of the like Luna Swarm funding, it's intended to be like funding for like the operational, like tedious project management and communications work that kind of needs to happen to cat herd people,
Cool.
and not necessarily like compensating people for working on models.
Cool. So yeah, I just sent a post in Lutaswarm. I hope it's comment or add anything to that. I was just trying to get clear in case anyone's coming in and asking about contributions.
And I think the other thing is that if we start developing project clarity, we may even be able to find like sort of multi-source funding. Because, for example, the thing I was talking about, Paul, and source credit is something that could be co-funded by, say, the cadCAD org and the Luna Swarm. If, like, you know, again, if we built those models and made sure that they were available to, you know, linked from the cadCAD org repos too, you'd end up with, like, to exactly Luke's point, like we need more good, high quality models out there for people to learn from. So as we develop clarity, which obviously is our first goal, build skills, create clarity, define projects. And as that happens, it'll be a lot easier to fund paid work in this area.
I just wanted to point out
Does
as
that
well
answer
that
your kind of question, Sandpiper? I saw you had asked in the chat.
Kind of. Yeah, I just noticed that the proposal was scoped not. I mean, like the scope of more recent proposals, like the Morphosis and I don't know, just any of the proposals that have been passing lately, was much more clear than the Luna Swarm, and so I just was wondering about that. But yeah, it sounds like it's just like we're the scoping is part of the work itself, and so yeah.
Yeah, basically the key is that we're really early in this swarm, from a skills, from a clarity, etc., and that what we're asking for is a relatively modest amount of funding to support the mostly the PM type work, and that as this continues, we'll have larger, probably, but more concrete proposals that are within this area of modeling and analysis of policies.
Yeah, it's a little more complex and paper than maybe some of the other work because this field is still kind of, the cadCAD skills are very emergent and the education isn't quite there. So it's more of like expanding education as well in the base of that. And we're kind of creating it as we go along. So yeah, I posted a thing in there, Sargam and Luke, if you want to weigh in further or correct anything that I said, but just we're starting to get more clarity for sure. And this is good feedback, Sandpiper, because people may ask in the community. But anyway, Luke is going to stake all his tokens. But yeah, so anything else further before we wrap the call for the week? And of course, you know, Z and Luke, you guys want to keep chatting. Jeff and I have to jump to another call. It's getting more clear. Appreciate it. Submitted the proposal and let us know if there's anything else we can do to help coordinate. And I'm going to speak with Sean about coming on as a potential mentor and let you know what he says.
Thanks as always for your cat herding, Jess.
Yeah.
Since part of the Luna Swarm is about education for these things, is there should some of this like lead Morphosis and like decide what kind of courses we're going to be teaching there as well? And like, is there some overlap there?
I hope so. I think maybe the experience we've had is that we tend to do research and then sort of distill it and then create education around it. So, you know, a good way to prototype this would be to take even just the models that Luke's made so far and ask how we would organize, you know, like both like presenting and educating on those things once we decide we've, like, say, made a decision. Like Luke was talking about, you know, making a call about the sort of maximum rates, and even just taking that and figuring out how to communicate it and how to teach the stuff related to it would be a great like first point of collaboration between Luna and Morphosis.
Hey Luke, do you have dates set up for when you're going to start? Or I guess does this team have dates set up for when? I guess Luke, I don't know if you got voluntarily selected to mentor. When are you? What kind of target date?
I mean, the me as a mentor feels weird because I'm like learning as I go, but um, uh, I'm if people are interested in kind of like collaborating on the model with me, we can start now, or like next week. In the past, I've done a lot of like just co-working sessions in the cafe, but like I was doing a lot of catch-up work this week, and last week I was sort of off for Thanksgiving. But I plan on doing that again as well. So just hanging out in the cafe with a screen share and the notebook up is probably a good way to start. But I don't know. I've had a few people like Jasper say that they were kind of interested in learning cadCAD and then get really busy. So I don't have like a super clear picture of who all is interested. If people are interested, um, definitely like let me know and we can schedule either one-on-one time or just async time in the cafe, depending on who it is and like what everybody's schedules and time zones look like.
Yeah, if you could get a time or post a time that you're going to be in there. I don't know if you're doing it ad hoc or if you plan it out.
Yeah, I generally am very unorganized, but and do things pretty ad hoc. But if are you let me say it this way: if you're interested, let's coordinate our schedules for next week, and we can have a couple of specific sessions on the calendar to work through this stuff. If that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, I am. Unfortunately, I don't know that I'm going to be able to do too much here in the near future. Got a baby coming on along the way, so that's going to create new opportunities. So, yeah, I don't know. I can't.
Yeah,
commit.
one thing that I would recommend for anybody that is interested is to take maybe like a couple of days and go through the cadCAD EDU course as like a starting point. And that's a good like it's free if you use the like Block.Science as like the code. Right now, you can kind of go through like a kind of really polished kind of guide in terms of getting things set up, working through some basic models. I just finished it last week, and it was really, really helpful in terms of getting up to speed. And if you start that and you're like, okay, this feels like something I'm interested in, then we can definitely collab on these models, even if it's like relatively small amount of time that you're available or interested in.
Do we need to end the meeting? I don't want to keep on asking questions.
Yep, if people have to drop, that's all gravy. I just wanted to add one other point. I sent the funds from the Gitcoin grant we ran last round about improvements to the voting OneHive model. So this is being funded by not just OneHive, but also a grant from last month. And Sandpiper, sorry if there's some like lack of clarity around work being scoped and rates and hours and so on. We're definitely like planning to keep this very like open to the community, and I think it's just sort of it's early for a lot of these things, so like understanding the amount of work being scoped and so on. So we're obviously very open to feedback and iterating these things as it moves forward. But ultimately, we're just excited to be building out models for the OneHive community, and are dedicated to bringing in funds to allow work to continue. We want to drive education and provide useful models for decision making in OneHive. So definitely open to feedback and how these proposals roll out and people get compensated and so on. But I think that's a good chat for this week. And yeah, happy to keep these as primarily work sessions moving forward rather than meetings. And yeah, if there's some async work sessions, definitely Luke is the primary person to coordinate with on models. And then we'll keep these weekly slots for check-ins, advice on next steps, and any other project coordination needed, if that works for everyone.
Sounds good to me.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, see you all next time. Thanks so much.
Catch you guys soon.
Hey,
I
Luke.
posted some links for you, Sandpiper and Richard, in the Lunaswarm channel about some education opportunities, and just post if you have any further questions.